Little introductory thing. Greetings. Hello. Good afternoon. Good morning. Good evening, depending on where you are. On this fast forward planet, this tumultuous planet, full of uncertainty, but also full of hope and innovation. And this broadcast, webcast, whatever you want to call it, is an experiment in connectedness. It started 3 months ago here at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. And 3 weeks ago, we started one particular thread here, which is sessions on how do you make impact online? How do you thrive online? And when I did the first introductory Thriving Online webinar across Columbia a few weeks ago, it said thriving online, question mark, really? In other words, can you? I'm convinced you can. It doesn't feel that way these days often. And today's the second session we've done on these Monday sessions. It's focused on collaboration, on making connections in service of sustainability and resilience outcomes. And just think about where we are. 30 years ago, when I was writing my book on the rainforest and the violence there, the burning season, 1989, I wrote it and it came out. That was the same year the first shuttle, the space shuttles, were taking pictures across the Amazon basin of the fire. That's a smoke cloud the size of India. And that had its limits. It had to be NASA took pictures. Astronauts like Katie Coleman here, you'll hear from in a minute, conveyed their live impressions and took pictures from the space shuttle and now the space station. And we slowly built this picture. And now we live in a landscape where a teacher in Western Massachusetts or in Iowa can harness the passions and interests of students to help sift imagery in almost real time, coming from a kind of an image broker, an enabling institute created by Dan Hammer. And between all of that, and then Reuters can come out with a great article based on some of the insights that result from that. So this is just an amazing moment. And here we have, you'll hear from Kim Young, who's a National Geographic Education Fellow, who's a social studies teacher in Weston, Massachusetts, not far from Boston, right?
Correct.
And who got hooked up with Dan Hammer, who I've known for many years, since he was in college. And Dan is a sort of an economist focused on the environment who's become a technologist in many ways. And he, like I am, is very focused on creating an interface. And what can you do with information over here that can be helpful over there? And Katie Coleman is a little bit of everything. She's has a chemistry background in polymer science and was talking yesterday on this program about getting past Kevlar. What can we do that's even stronger than Kevlar? She's a fantastic musician. She's been on multiple space shuttle flights, and she spent 6 months on the space station. She's very involved with education capacity. So the conversation we're going to have today in the next hour with you folks out there listening, and I see you're there, is about how do you take this further? What can we do to build on this great model that emerged from these, so far from this new enterprise, these people getting together. So I want to start with the guy at the middle, I think, Dan, because you're kind of like, none of this would be happening, I think, if you haven't been creating the interface. So Dan Hammer, could you just say who you are and what you are up to that has sort of spurred this possibility?
Sure. Thanks, Andy. So I'm a data scientist, and I can say that with impunity because no one really knows what that means. The way in which I sort of express it is that I'm a programmer by trade, but an economist by training. And the broad idea here is to try to parse signal from noise. And so I've been working on with satellite imagery, signal from. Are you able to hear me all right?
It's a little choppy, but I hear you okay.
Little choppy, okay. Well, I'll try this, and if it doesn't work, then I will move as needed. But the basic idea here is that we've been working with satellite imagery, which is this unique source of raw information. It's globally comparable, it's comprehensive, and it's credible and it's compelling. Everyone sort of understands what the Earth looks like from above, even if they've only seen it from Google Earth. Only I think we're up to, like Katie would be able to say, but probably still less than 600 people who have seen the Earth from really high above. But satellites afford the opportunity for the rest of us to see the Earth as it changes in this very compelling, very credible way.
Yeah.
Sorry, Andy, what was that?
No, I'm just affirming what you're saying.
Oh, got it.
Yeah.
And so the idea here is that this industry, though, was built not for normal people. It was originally built for scientists and defense analysts. It was not built for reporters and activists, even though it's incredibly valuable. A good example of how it was valuable was we had started to report on the Uyghur detention centers about 18 months ago in northern China. This is the Muslim minority, and there was two guys, probably one's on the line right now, Ed Boyda, our chief scientist, and basically the idea is that two guys sitting in a coffee shop in Berkeley could refute the Chinese claims, Chinese government's claims, who said that they were not building these facilities. And we could just look at the imagery and be like, well, we can see you. And the idea here is that it was not that complicated. And there was a lot of sort of manual work and that the work that could be done not just by Dr. Ed Boyd, a physics professor, but also done by students in middle and high school. It just required a little bit more processing and the facilities to do so, and that was the start of Earthrise education, which is just to stack up all these images and allow the ability for the facilities, or build the facilities for students to, as part of their core curricula in the natural and social sciences, to measure change on the Earth that can be directly piped to scientists, activists, and reporters, especially about environmental and humanitarian events.
Not hearing you, Andy.
See, I tried to mute so you couldn't hear me typing furiously all my notes. And here we are again in not Zoomville. This is StreamYardville, but same issues. So there's also this journalism interface that you've been working at as well. I think what's really interesting here is the multidimensional aspect. You've got journalists over here. Earthrise.media had been working to develop a scheme, a way for journalists on deadline to actually find satellite imagery that might fit a story on the islands China was filling in over in the South China Sea, or Amazon destruction. So that's another part of this too, right? So there's like the satellite in the sky, whether it's NASA or the private ones. There's teachers in classrooms eager to engage their students in not learning by doing that has some outcome in the world, which is pretty exciting. And then there's this thing called the media. So how's that played out, that end?
It's a great question. We started with just environmental journalists, and we really wanted to sit there. We wanted to take the objective of Earthrise Media was to take the least cost source of credible and compelling information about environmental change and distribute it to the people who already commanded audience and created content, or professional journalists. We've been doing that. We will continue to do that for years. The problem is, and Andy, you probably know this more than anyone else, it's difficult to make a buck, not even just make a buck, but pay a mortgage with independent environmental journalism. And we are a 501c3 nonprofit. We depend on the generosity of strangers, but we think that there's some economies of scale of working with not just professional journalists, but amateur reporters like students. Same technology, same data, same applications in a lot of cases, but we think that we can have sort of a sustainable stream of revenue to this nonprofit by working with in classrooms, especially now that half of students will be cycling into classrooms remotely. And this Earthrise education platform offers a way in which to facilitate conversation from those online with those in classrooms through which we could talk about this peer review capacity, peer review of data. But it's an interactive and collaborative platform in the natural and social sciences, which is going to be even more important. I just heard that Harvard's only going to let 40% of their students on campus at any given time next year. I expect Kim can speak to some of the plans for classrooms in Massachusetts, the middle and high school classrooms who might be doing the same thing. And so we think that we could take that same technology we developed for professional journalists, apply it to amateur reporters, and maybe stay around long enough to have more and more impact.
So we'll hear from Katie in a minute on sort of like looking at this from her perspective as a former astronaut who was in that education space. But I'd love to hear from Kim on when was the first time you even thought this might be something you or your students could do?
Well, it was right before I had met Dan. I had the opportunity to travel with researchers from Woods Hole up into the Arctic through a program called Polar Trek, sponsored by the National Science Foundation. And being with the teams from the Woods Hole Research Center, they were actually working on the NASA Above project. And I got to see a little bit of previews of how satellite imagery is being used in the field. And the two major takeaways I had was, one, how important it is, and we're not using this type of data, not exposing students to this type of data at the high school level or middle school level. And secondly, that I could, as you know, I'm a world history teacher, I have no training in this area, but like I could understand it and I could engage with it. So that kind of planted a seed of innovation in the back of my mind. And when I had the chance to meet with Dan, it really just, you know, it was a perfect kind of timing of that I was ready to then, as he's, you know, kind of selling me this idea, saying, you know, we can actually do this with students. And I was kind of hooked and engaged and ready to go. And it's really around this idea of the possibilities of allowing students to identify data and then storytell and take action, which any teacher in any classroom gets really excited about.
And now, of course, as Dan was saying, you know, we're all sort of in this mode where we're going online more and more anyway, whether we want to or not, at education institutions from a high school to through universities. So this feels even more ripe for filling some of that gap. And I think, what do you think about how it relates to how students, the motivation factor? You know, it's hard to get students motivated through Zoom. My wife is in education, and I have many friends in education who are so challenged by this moment of how do you do something impactful with students? Does this feel like its moment is here in spades, or am I imagining something?
No, it was really interesting. So we did our first pilot with the tool just on the eve of the pandemic hitting schools. So I finished the first running of the lesson plans and engaging with the tool in classes. And then we all got sent home, and we had the opportunity to run a second pilot then with Rachel Hansen's students out in Iowa, and they did it totally online. And what I saw from both her students and my students is that once we went online, the first thing all the students needed was safety and security. So once we got them home, we got everyone feeling, you know, safe and secure. And once things settled down, as we shifted our educational models, you know, we're not focusing on high stakes testing. We're not focusing on grades. We're focusing on learning. And what students really wanted then was a sense of purpose. And that's what they were really, really hungry for. They wanted work, but they wanted meaningful work. You can't do bad pedagogy or bad content on Zoom. Like, it just falls so flat. Like, there's no way to make it work. Right. So a tool like we were using with Earthrise Education, it filled that need of students being able to have a purpose even when they're from home. And that became really important. You know, students still wanted to learn. They didn't want to learn through worksheets. They didn't want to learn through lectures, but they wanted to learn and they wanted to take action. It gave them a sense of stability and purpose and identity when they're stuck at home, when everything else that used to define who they were was kind of gone. Right. And we were really excited to see that it's a social tool in a lot of ways. I talked to Dan a lot about this. You know, the most exciting thing I saw in the classroom is that as students engaged and were mapping, it was facilitating conversations. It didn't make kids they didn't take their computers and go into a corner and start mapping silently by themselves. They'd find a polygon or they'd find a mine, they'd flip their computer around and ask their peers about it. We can do that on Zoom. And students know how to do that on Zoom. We can share screens, we can show stuff, and it actually facilitates this authentic conversation about learning in action versus trying to take something that only works in the traditional classroom and make it work online. Right. This is kind of pre-built for hybrids.
And then there's the reality here, of course, that these are real issues in the real world right now. And not only is the gold mining in that part of the Amazon that we haven't even talked about the actual story yet, but not only is it destructive of the landscape, not only is it violating the rights of the Yanomami nation, but COVID-19 is out of control in Brazil. And anytime you have an incursion like this, you're bringing the disease. Even the army going into these regions, there's been signs that they're bringing in the virus, even as they're handing out masks. So if that doesn't motivate students, I'm not quite sure what does. Katie, you've worked at this. Just to describe your sort of the astronaut part of you that was focused on education and classrooms and getting data where it's needed. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, I'd say that the biggest thing for me is, literally looking back at the Earth and knowing that everybody is down there and really wanting to be able to share that view with people. I mean, and share the experience that I was having. So I would say it's more about sharing than educating, but I think sharing is educating and storytelling. And I've really been interested to listen to both Dan and Kim. And I know Dan, and I'm happy to meet Kim. We're actually not that many miles away, Kim. I'm out in Western Mass in Shelburne Falls. But it's one thing to say, oh, I wish I could just bring this awareness of what the Earth looks like, of what, and I actually, there's a thing on the website for Earthrise that says local insight, global perspective, that I think is a really powerful phrase. And everybody wants that. And when I go to give a talk somewhere, I often want to go and find pictures of the place that I'm talking so they can realize, like, this is what you look like from space. And I ask, who was born in 2010, 2011, that's when I was up on the space station. I mean, that means that I took your picture. You were in this picture, unless you were traveling that day. And yet, getting that data out there in a way that people can see it. I mean, there's just so much. On our mission alone, we took, 60,000 pictures, most of them of the Earth, right? And but most of them for good reasons, something that was either assigned or just looked fascinating in a perspective we wanted to share. And they've gone partway. There's a website called the Gateway to Astronaut Photography. And now Dan takes from many more satellites than just space station, but just from a space station perspective, if I go and I say, I want a picture of Weston, Massachusetts, I mean, there's thousands and thousands, like probably 30,000 pictures of Weston, Massachusetts, probably because we have a lot of astronauts from Massachusetts. And so then, I mean, and when I'm going to go give a talk, I want one that kind of shows like, hey, this is where you are on the Earth. And then I want one that looks down and shows you, hey, look what else is right around you. And so it's about wanting to share that perspective. And I love this. I mean, I think it's actually fascinating that it takes this interdisciplinary sharing of being able to write algorithms, somebody who thinks with that brain, who thinks about what is needed, who thinks about what it can be used for now that they actually figured out this tool, and that it can be used for education as well. And this project of doing it at schools, I mean, I agree with you completely. I mean, you're the educator, but purpose, people and kids especially want to do something, and actually girls, when we talk about how to motivate girls for math and science, often it's, if we just say, here's this box and can you take it apart and put it back together? It's just not the kind of challenge that they're looking for. But if you tell them it'll save lives if you do, then they are interested. And so this is a perfect combination for an infinite number of applications. And I'm just thrilled that we're celebrating it. So maybe some of our viewers will find even more ways to put what Dan is doing to work.
So Dan, I keep, being blown away by AI, and some of our friends at National Geographic, like Steve Brumby, are working on these amazing ways to use machine intelligence to sift data. There's Global Fishing Watch, I wrote about it at the New York Times several years ago, where the algorithm replaced the individual sifting for illegal fishing operations, looking at data from ships. And so why does it take kids in a classroom to do this?
Well, that's so I was actually part of the team that founded Global Forest Watch a long time ago. And one of the benefits there was to be able to see how people used the data. So the user, the Google Analytics, basically. And Google Analytics from, over the course of a year and a half, I was looking back the first year and a half, and there was this sort of steady beat of usage of Global Forest Watch. And Global Forest Watch is tracking deforestation using satellite imagery. And there'd be like, 1,500 people per day, punctuated by these spikes up to 40,000 people in a day, unique visits. And those spikes corresponded to when journalists use the data in the service of their reporting. That is, people who could contextualize these flare-ups of pink pixels where there has been deforestation, but could contextualize them with whether or not those pink pixels were illegal, or they happened in an indigenous territory, or associated with some sort of economic forcing function. But that context ended up being really, really important. And so the whole idea behind Earthrise with the professional journalists was just to tighten that loop between the data and the people who could tell the story behind it. The human story behind it. And a lot of the times, though, this imagery is just, it requires some human intelligence or interpretation. And, some way in which to determine whether or not an area has been cleared because of sort of human intention, or if it was just sort of a dying tree. But to apply that human intelligence, and it turns out you don't need to have a PhD in biophysics or geology or geography in order to do this. A lot of the time, it just takes some, careful consideration by young people who apparently in the classroom like to do word searches. Except it's probably way better if those word searches have a real life application and purpose.
Interesting.
And so there's a lot of applications. In fact, we think there are thousands of stories like this every year that can benefit from student derived information and labeling of satellite images, and mostly the change between satellite imagery. So Katie talked about contextualizing a place. And I also think that the benefit of having repeated imagery of the same place over time is to sort of position this in space and time, how things are changing, which ends up being really important, especially for environmental events. But students are able to do it, and I've been struck by like how much better they are than I am at doing it. So we're just trying to operationalize that.
They've grown up with this facility with
Apparently.
Visual and data imagery and the Instagram generation. I'm probably going to do a session on here in a week or two on Instagram with George Steinmetz, a photographer I did a book with recently, who has 1 million followers. And
I love his feed.
But we're going to try to figure out, what can you do with those tools to generate into not just clicks and likes, but actual impact. One of the most, valuable, one of the most important things about this is, and I'll just show you here the tweet, the Reuters story. I'm not going to say the Reuters story resulted on its own in the change in Brazil, but here you had, this is one component of the Reuters story that resulted from the imagery that the students were analyzing and others. And here's the story from Reuters just a few days ago. Yeah, July 3rd, Brazil court orders eviction of illegal gold miners from Yanomami Reserve. So this is this responsive ecosystem that we keep thinking about in other contexts. I just did a session on here a week ago, essentially asking the question, can we build an immune system for the planet, like a digital immune system when it comes to pandemic risk? So when there are little flickers and signals of something awry in Wuhan or wherever, or in the Congo, what can you, how can you use information more intelligently, both whether it's human monitored or AI, and how do you build a response? So I think you see right here with this project, you have that potential expressed. And I think that's really cool. I hope the students, one of the things about students is interesting. When I was at Pace University, I helped a colleague teach a course that was an environmental clinic. And of course, you have a cohort of students in one grade just for that year as in high school, and in college, they're just that year as they're moving through. So how do you build the continuity? So do you have to train a whole new batch of students next year for to build the capacity to do this? Or is there a way to actually have the students help each other sustain that capacity? That's an interesting question. So Kim, like classroom dynamics in high school, what would be a next step to take this further, or to normalize it, or even spread it outside of these global issues to local ones? What are you part of a network? Are there people thinking about this, working on this fall?
I mean, making any plans for this fall are kind of, I think, we're at, I think there's no concrete plans, but what we are seeing is, Dan and I have been talking to a cohort of teachers in kind of Iowa and across the country, and there's National Geographic educators and a lot of educators thinking about satellite imagery. So it's more that I think this is something that educators are ready for, but we need some things to see, like with Earthrise Education, to start innovating and dreaming and believing. Right now, there's not even, this is so rarely done, I think, in most classroom settings, that this is a great place to get it started. And I think, next steps involve building out more investigations that will apply to kind of different content and different grade levels and different classrooms. For us, the Yanomami investigation was a really good fit because we were finishing up a unit. I actually teach medieval world history. So it's a very kind of narrow time period, but as a part of that, I'm strongly compelled to teach history of Indigenous people today, because many students, first of all, many students in the United States don't learn about Indigenous history. And on top of that, they learn about it only as a thing of the past. So for me, this was a really powerful interdisciplinary investigation, because my students not only learned about some environmental issues and about mercury, but it was really powerful for them to hear a case study of Indigenous people today, and then an appropriate way that they could take action. So I think some of the next steps are, as we continue to not everyone's going to be able to engage with the Yanomami.
Right.
So finding, getting more investigations, and as we have more teachers try them out, give us feedback of how are the lessons working, how are students engaging with the tool in different classes.
I wonder if that could be actually what happens this fall, is inviting brainstorming from a bunch of kids around the country. Like, what are the things we're thinking of making this, part of a curriculum? What are the things in your area or any place you've wondered about that you would investigate, and see what that list starts looking like? But in doing it, maybe there's just enough of an Earthrise little project that could let them understand what they really might be able to do.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
I'd love to facilitate that. I've done a couple of sessions on Sustain What that were student driven. In that case, they were doctoral students, but I did one on poetry recently that had high school kids sharing earth stanzas, environmental poems here. So we can use this platform.
One interesting thing we did see is that students independently, as they were doing research projects outside of this, now include satellite imagery as a source that they look to for data. And they also ask questions, and they'll go to kind of open source satellite imagery, and they'll say, like, I'm looking at sea level rise in the Maldives, and they're looking at change over time to see, is there anything they can identify and then screenshot and use those for their own research. That's something I've never seen students do before. But I learned about it with Dan, so
that's very cool.
I can do that.
Dan, what about there was a project that Sally Ride Science started called EarthCam, where it was literally middle school kids that would design environmental projects, and then they in advance would know, like, next semester the camera's going to be up there, and we're going to be able to tell it where to point and when to take a picture. And it was along these lines, but your project lets you be global all the time. It's not dependent on, what's going to happen up on the space station. And I just thought they might have projects that they can see were successful or not. And I know that for us on the station, every experiment, there's sort of a democracy, and, you're supposed to not spend more time on one experiment or the other. And it took a lot of time to just change their batteries. I mean, often because the cameras that they had and things like that. And so basically we weren't really ever scheduled to change their batteries in the middle of the night, but somebody on the crew always did.
Oh.
Well, no, we just happened to be up, change those batteries. Yep.
So you brought to mind some other things I've been thinking about. That, and I like the idea of how do you maximize the general capacity for inquiry-based learning and doing. In other words, I think that's what we're getting at. So there's sort of, if you're a student or a group of students and you want to explore wetlands loss in the Hudson Valley, you can put those terms into something, know what the data are, and have a template for how to turn that into a story. And this is all there. ESRI has their story
maps.
Story maps.
Yeah.
It sounds like the components are all there. And I assume, Kim, that this all fits the standards that teachers have to think about. Is there anything about this that, I mean, anything innovative I know is impeded by the now?
Well, I mean, I do see shifts in state and local standards that are more skill-based versus content-based. So all of this fits with skill-based standards because it's the skills of inquiry. So almost most classrooms can indeed engage with that. If it's in a specific school district that is heavily connected to standardized testing that is more content-focused, this would be much more challenging. But one of the positives of the pandemic is it kind of increased questions being brought forward about, the usefulness of those standardized tests and what they're really showing us. And it may open up some more wiggle room for teachers to stay focused on skill-based standards.
That sounds like a good trend. Actually, here at Columbia, the things I'm planning to teach here are more skills than they're skills and approaches to problem solving more than content. And I think the more we switch into that mode, I think the better our chances are of building the resilient adaptive capacity we want, and from whatever grade you're in forward.
Well,
I don't know if y'all know that I'm also employed at ASU, Arizona State University. I'm their explorer in residence, which is a very cool job. And they're just a pretty innovative place. Andy, I just lost my train of thought.
I'm a huge fan of ASU.
Go ahead.
I could think of things that are going on at ASU that are relevant. They do a decision theater. They have this dynamic data space where you can sit there as a mayor or someone at the Pentagon can figure out priorities based with live data interfaces. And I think that decision theater concept is kind of what we're talking about in a way. So it's like whether you're a group of students thinking about wetlands loss in your neighborhood, or whether you're thinking, how can I help the Yanomami, or other than, liking an Instagram feed, what you really want is information in pursuit of an outcome. So that model,
right.
They've been working on that for like 15 years. And when I think about what Dan and I brainstorm all the time on what are the flows that you would need and who's the moderator, mediator, facilitator. And I think the answers are there. It's just, having this conversation, for example, today, I don't see as the end of anything. This is the first of what we could do to drive this question forward and come up with some answers.
I've actually remembered what was in my head, which was they just started basically a problem-solving major at ASU.
Oh, I like that.
And it's formally called technological leadership. But it is about, it's an interdisciplinary, it's got all these different departments, concurrent classes that come from different departments. But who wouldn't want to hire a problem solver later in life? So I think, it's pretty neat in that respect. But I just see so much potential for these projects. Dan, there's going to be people that, the way you figure out how to make this data accessible is still quite a mystery to me. It's not something that I instinctively, feel in my gut. And yet in doing this, some of the kids are going to see that part of, wow, they took spaghetti and made like what we could see on a plate. And they're going to understand that process and they're going to become data scientists. And so I just think it's wonderful, all the different implications of this.
Well, so that really hits home what the objective here. The skill here is data science, and which is effectively technological problem solving. It's the broad discipline of finding patterns within data. So you can do it wherever. I mean, there's data scientists in healthcare and policing everywhere. But 90% of data science, and I can say this because I got my PhD at Cal and I was a fellow at the Berkeley Institute for Data Science, so I can say with some authority that 90% of data science is not analysis. It's the cleaning and the review and the quality assessment of the data, the underlying data. And I never learned that. And we didn't do that in school. It's sort of frustrating to confront that when you normally get published is the analysis rather than the underlying data. And so all this platform really is trying to figure out those generic tools to collect and peer review data, just like you'd peer review manuscripts in a peer review publication. But it's to engage with that 90% of data science that it's like banging your head against a wall. But if you can do it enough and you feel it in your bones, then you get to these outcomes that are much, much better. And so the skill here, I think, is that I like the idea of calling it technological problem solving more than data science, which is a strange discipline right now. But that's what it is. It's exploration. It's like structured observation or classroom exploration. We have to figure out on the marketing terms here. Kim and I do. But those two are good candidates.
Well, Kim, I know you probably hear place-based, inquiry-based learning. There's all this again, my wife is in this same space doing sustainability education, and there's PBL and there's Jim Bentley, a good friend who does place-based learning and geo-inquiry at National Geographic. It feels like the priorities in education, at least where there's some capacity for anything other than basic stuff, are there. The other question we all thinking about these days, of course, is inclusiveness. And I had 2 sessions on here so far that focused on the data gaps, not just data gaps, but the digital divide. So many parts of the country, let alone the world, where you don't have routine internet, high-speed access. You don't have the capacity. You don't have the teaching capacity often. So that's another facet of this that has to be worked on at the same time. And I think actually ASU is really good at online education too. So maybe Katie and I will go back to Michael Crow and who I like really. He's one of my longtime fan. I'm a longtime fan of Michael Crow and everything that's done there. So we could think about who else should be in the room, I guess is what I'm saying. So who next should be on a wider version of this conversation? Superintendents?
I say we got to get the students. Number one, we got to get.
Sure. If we had more time, I absolutely would have the students.
There's a group. Megan Smith was a part of catalyzing. I think Megan Smith was CTO under Obama, and they're called the CSOs, the Chief Science Officers of schools, high schools in the Midwest, or not in the Midwest, but more Arizona, New Mexico, but then actually all over the world. I think there's 70 different countries now involved. And instead of running for class president, maybe you'd run to be the chief science officer. And then it's you who are getting advice from your friends and pulling your friends, what do you want to know about? And so maybe bringing them into this room would be a good start.
So those are students. I didn't realize Megan is talking about students. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Megan is on our advisory board because I worked for her for a long time. I still feel like I work for her, which is a great experience. But that's exactly the type of group. I will if we do this again, I'll pull in there that lead for that's a great idea. It's sort of like finding. It seems like educators run in packs, sort of like environmental journalists, and there's like these networks at different layers, and that's a great network to tap into. Megan has been saying this a lot. And we finally have something that people can interact with, which is
you could send up something. Yep. Yeah.
It's taken a long time. I mean, like I said, this is environmental journalism and environmental education is not. It's a hustle, and it's a hard hustle, and so things take longer than we ever expect. But we're finally here, so we can engage them more productively.
I like that basically we're reinventing the definition of a lab class. And I got this thought from what's one of the ASU professors brought up, where they were talking about how to teach their labs this fall and what could be a lab course and whatnot. And he said, you want to teach my lab in person with people spread all over, but my lab is about being out and reading maps and understanding the geography. And so I need to go and look over somebody's shoulder and see where they really think they are on this map or what it's saying to them. And I can't do that from 6 feet away, but I can do that online. And so realizing that we could use this, in a sort of combining with maybe visual Google Street Map imagery outside, that it could be a navigation kind of, outside orienteering kind of thing, where, I don't know. I'm just trying to think of, I'm a chemist, so I hate to tell people not to be in the laboratory, but we live in a giant laboratory.
It's true.
I think as we build the table bigger, as we keep making the table bigger, if also to keep it interdisciplinary. I think this is, you would not expect, they say, oh, you teach environmental science. Oh, you teach, earth science. Oh, you teach that. No, I teach medieval world history. And this was, this idea that that's also a lab class, and what, all of our inquiries in any discipline all have these common elements, and that we should be doing these things in all of our classes, that it's not just science classes get to do all the cool stuff. Because ultimately the greatest environmental challenges will be solved by interdisciplinary teams. We need the scientists to get the data, but then we need those historians and poets to communicate it. So we keep the team diverse, I think, is important.
And we need social studies / geography is so critical to the sustainability questions. Science just delineates the greenhouse gases, the biodiversity. It doesn't tell you what to do or how societies react. So without the social sciences and without history, there's a guy named Scott Knowles who's been doing this daily, 5-day-a-week webcast on the pandemic from the standpoint of disaster history. And by the way, it goes well back through the medieval period. Yeah. So there's so many opportunities that only can be addressed when you have those contexts in the same room. And I'm trying to figure out, using this platform, how we can do more of that.
Yeah.
So it's fun to have a wild card person in a conversation like this. So I should probably have someone on here who's completely unrelated to the subject, but has some potential to draw on it.
We haven't.
Actually, I was going to say, I love that, we're all unrelated in some aspect of it. Do you know what I mean? And so That's what I think is pretty cool.
There's a question that just came in from JP Isham from LinkedIn. How can we provide lab quality learnings packages for at-home web-based learning? How do we cover lab content when not in a lab effectively? He's kind of re-articulating the point Katie just made.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things there, one of the facilities here, so what Kim described before is that students would turn their computers to each other and say, what do you think about this? There's probably, sometimes you can't turn your computer to someone across the world, for example. There's facilities and processes that we're building in for just like the peer review of the data submissions of each person. Because, the lab is you experiment, collect, and then you collaborate and you assess you peer review, you review each other's work. And so just making that easier to do both across the world and asynchronously is that's the real value added here of this particular platform. And then additionally, which we haven't gotten to yet, is Katie did this cool thing. There's this photo of Katie, I don't know what that skyport is called, the
cupola?
The cupola, right?
Cupola. And we wish it was a transporter, but it is a great window on the world.
Well, and so Katie did this. I got to see Katie did this. I would say sort of like a performance at the Cal Academy, where it was sort of describing what it feels like to be in that space, and it was very, very powerful for a lot of people who were there, and that I'd heard afterwards. And so one of the questions is once you do this observation, how do you then communicate it? And part of it will be the aggregation of the data and talking about sort of rates of change, for example. But there's got to be another way in which to communicate that structured observation onto the world, and do so in a way that is formatted for, I don't know, social media, or not just social media. I don't mean to throw that out there gratuitously. a way in which you communicate right now.
Well, what about making a video?
We haven't gotten there yet.
Part of a project. I was thinking of, there's a synthetic biology project that happens with high schools and colleges where they make these teams and they're inventing, new molecules or whatever, but every team is required to have like a storyteller person who is someone who's designing the exhibit. And so these things it's not just optional, like, okay, who's going to talk, who's going to say, there's presenter people. And so it really, everybody's skills, they don't have to be the person who can think about the biology or think about the data.
Yeah.
It's included. But I think that, it's the, boy, I don't know where my memory is today. But anyways, breakthrough challenge, the junior breakthrough challenge, where their kids are asked to explain some concept in 3 minutes that they think people should know about. And so this could be part of the project, is to have the team explain, not just have Reuters' point of view, but the kids' point of view, what they learned, and that there's a YouTube channel that answers the range for that.
I think also the format that's really coming into like being these infographics, especially the changing info, so animated GIFs basically, and so. That's where we found, at least with the professional journalists, the best use of the derived data, like what Reuters did, Simon Scar at Reuters did, but thinking about other ways in which to make it available for students to be able to report on what they've seen. And I see in the comments that someone said, we're not promoting, the idea of not promoting causation when it's really correlation. Totally agree, but sort of structured observation of what's there and what you can verify with satellite imagery, and just present in such a way that other people can respond to. I think is really powerful in a way that where you can present your sort of like the awe and wonder that Katie had talked about from the cupola, but do so. Make it more available to more people.
Two thoughts. So, I mean, first of all, along the lines of storytelling, one of the things we're doing with Earthrise Education is, with the curriculum that goes with the tool, is that we're scaffolding that idea of storytelling. It's a skill that's taught, and it's a skill that students are practicing through the ramp up to the investigation itself, and then to the taking action piece. So it's not something awesome. And now we storytell. It's definitely kind of built in, and that's something, as a teacher, we're being very intentional in scaffolding it and having students practice that skill. The second question, though, of this question of labs and what's going to become, I think it's actually really empowering for us as teachers to say, we don't know, and let's try and fail and then get better. But then to keep equity in mind. I can think of some really cool ways to do that would not be equitable and that would not be very accessible for many students. But then I can also think of, online isn't always online. I can make things 360 by just having students put something up underneath a table and sit down underneath it and think of it, looking at the world from a different perspective, that can get them, flip their thinking, that doesn't cost as much money. So
right.
It's a lot going on.
The comments coming in are interesting, and I think they get at another model that Dan kind of alluded to. This Science Cathedral here says the infographics also suffer from statistics curse, where we aggregate dissimilar terms. Social sciences fall into this trap more often than not. Now, if you have students in kind of a red team, blue team approach, or if you have, this is where interdisciplinary looks at the same data can reveal some of those. You have internal peer review, basically. And then public peer review if you're presenting this stuff publicly. So that's a great learning experience. That you show the same data in different ways, and you come up with different stories. And that getting students more. Even now with the COVID-19, I've had many sessions on how do you convey flattening the curve, and how do you look at these data? Cases. Is it cases that matters? Is it hospitalizations that matters? Is it what? This is a great learning moment in that sense, even as it's a terrifying moment for us in so many ways. And finding a way for students to interrogate a data set or be driving those questions feels like a great opportunity. I
think that authentic audience is key. So if the student's work stops with me, it's very limiting. But if the students are publishing and sharing their data with stakeholders, people in the field, and getting authentic feedback, they're then learning through the process. And that feels very different. I'm there guiding on the side and helping them improve as they go along. But then when they put the final product out, if they're hearing from the public and people in industry, the feedback feels really real. And then it's not about the grade, it's about the process and learning and getting a skill.
Right. Yeah, but one thing that reminds me of too, sorry, I'm kind of losing my voice. I'm so excited. When I was also at PACE, I co-taught a course in documentary film production around sustainability questions. We went to Cuba and studied the impact of ecotourism. We did one on the future of coral reefs in Curacao. And what would happen is January, February, students were doing all the preparation and planning. Then spring break, they went and shot tons of footage and interviews, came back and then editing. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to have, once we have that material, and just think of this in the context of data, have students go at it in different ways. Have like a rogue unit. You create the class documentary and then create another one that's like totally offbeat and throw them out there and see what works or doesn't work. It's that kind of fearless experimentation, I think, is part of this too, I think. So let's see. There was a question that this JP Isham, I know the name and I'm forgetting why. He said something really great here. Let's create a Curiosity Lab box set, like the magic kit I gave my son once for Christmas. Provide shared results as Katie Dan suggests, socially or by video. Lab project would be a research impacts of mining, elements of the mine, impacts of the mine. That's very interesting. It really, is that in a way what this is, Kim? Is this a curiosity lab?
Yeah, I mean, it's yes, in different ways. And I mean, I think there's ways that we can provide more or less structure depending upon the time you want to give students. So in terms of letting them follow different elements of the story or different.
Whoops. There was a little bit of a freeze there. Katie, are you still with us?
I am.
Okay.
You can still hear me, you just can't see me. There's some elements of, but also having some basic understandings in the beginning when we're talking about, with this lab in particular, talking about uncontacted peoples and the ways to be curious and setting some baselines and correcting some misunderstandings that students may have. But yeah, the design of the lesson plans are very inquiry curiosity focused.
Well, let me tell you then sort of where we're headed with this, because then I'd love to get feedback from not just you guys, but also the crowd here, which is we're working on the next, we did one pilot lesson. We're working on 3 more right now. Nominally, we're working on one on wildfire recovery, coastal loss, inundation, and then the last one would be on either child mining in DRC or watering holes in somewhere. We have to work on that third one. So there's 3 more down the pike. These will be made available for classrooms to test and trial. We're still in that phase, and that's what we're hope to hear from people at earthrise.education for those who would want to sort of participate in this next round of investigations to see how it goes and to suffer the glitches that will inevitably be there. And then the idea is to post all of the learning materials that like Kim is working on, educator guides and the standards alignment work publicly on earthrise.education, and then have in there to have like basically an Ask Me Anything with the expert like Katie or like Jake Norton, the Everest climber, or the sort of the sponsoring organization. So that'll all be public, those educator guides and the Ask Me Anything. And then there'll be some, actually doing the investigation on the platform will be reserved for classes. One of the issues here is that this imagery is really expensive. I mean, really expensive. I mean, we're competing against like the DoD for this imagery. We're effectively using the stuff that's on the clipping room floor for these for these investigations, but to education. And we need to sort of protect that value for the commercial satellite image providers. So that has to be behind the education curtain. But all the educator guides and Ask Me Anythings are available for everyone else, which sort of gets to JP's point here, which is that there's a little bit more of a dialogue that's available for additional labs that could be done, or going back and forth with the expert in the field. And Kim can correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the most powerful pieces of these pilots have been when the explorers and scientists and researchers actually come into the classroom via Google Hangout or video. And so to sort of operationalize that a little bit more, tighten that loop as well. But anyway, if you're interested in hearing more or doing more with those 3 investigations, you can send us a note at earthrise.education.
But there's some great comments that just came in. People are listening. JP says to Katie, you should connect with Chris Kemp, and work on some astronaut training, essentially online space camp. Chris is the previous CTO, et cetera, et cetera. But this
Okay.
one, and here's one, LinkedIn user. I'll find out who that is. This program that I developed for NASA has hundreds of educational materials in English and Spanish that are used regularly by students and teachers, including pre-recorded webinars. And there's a website link there. These all get archived right away, so people can scroll back through this video and find these. I want to show you, I think I have 2 ideas for you, Dan. As we draw toward the end here, we're going to go for a final round of your brainstorm ideas for something we can actually do next week or whatever. But let me just show a couple things. This is, I've worked with these folks, planningforwildfire.org. They have a whole template on how to go into a community and help them plan a future for wildfire. In other words, you're not going to stop wildfire in big chunks of the West. But you can build a zoning plan. You can work with ecosystem mapping and find ways forward. So I guarantee you, if we loop them into wildfire recovery and or planning process, there's a curriculum there. And then I want to show you one other, which is here at Columbia next week. We just had a big meeting on what's called managed retreat. And, I have to switch. Oh, hold on a second. I'm still getting used to some aspects of StreamYard. Managed retreat is, this concept of, again, how do you invent communities knowing that sea level will be rising for centuries to come? Slowing global warming will slow sea level rise, but we're in a world of no new normal coastline. What a great learning opportunity that is, right? If you're in a coastal community, how do you design for sea level rise? So both of those are arenas where there's a lot of work underway here at Columbia and elsewhere that we could, maybe help actualize that. And I don't know what else comes to mind. Kim, we're sort of toward the end here, but again, it's the beginning. If we had a session next week, whether it was with students or a wider group of teachers or someone who helps create curricula, NSTA, Science Teachers Association, or somebody, National Social Studies, whatever it is. I know it's there. I got an award from them once for my book on the Arctic. So what's the next iteration here? Where do we go from here?
I think, as we've been talking about, it's getting more people, more students and more teachers and more administrators involved and behind the idea. And I think showing them, and then I think they'll be sold. And I also think we need to do more piloting in urban and rural schools to see in terms around issues of equity. How is this working when classrooms are not one-to-one? And can we get more? Okay, maybe I'm totally changing my answer. We need to get politicians to the table and we need to talk about having technology access and internet access as a human right and universal access. So totally changed my idea. We got to get every kid internet.
Absolutely.
And we can talk.
We did one session on that, but I'm going to do it
Okay.
more. That's so so vital to this, to having a level landscape. And one of the things that was so clear in some sessions we did here, that COVID-19, even if you have internet access and you're poor, that means you have one iPad, and the parent is using that to find the job, and the kid's using that to do homework, and so there's a lot of work to do. But it's been wonderful getting started here. There was another good comment or two that came in, and I'll just post JP Isham's last one here. Our UNGC context at Sustainable Energy for All, CEO Walter Mondati, and Principles for Responsible Investment might support all these efforts. Okay, so in this course of an hour, I think we got some things going here. And let's do it again, if you're okay with that.
Anytime.
Sounds great.
It
was awesome.
So any last thought, Katie? I think Katie and I should talk to ASU for one thing.
It's a fascinating place, and I noticed Mary Loader from Online Education is on there. She and I have cooked up a number of different wild things there. I was going to say, in support of education and educators, I mean, these are frontline workers as well, and to realize. I mean, I know that I often go, oh, there's all these great things to do, and I'll bring this to my kid's teacher, and I mean, they are already at capacity, and Kim can jump in, but I just say, be gentle with your teachers, even with your ideas, bring them, but realize that they have only a certain capacity to implement, and you really have to bring them what you have to offer, and then respect what what they do with it, because I don't think we all really understand or appreciate their world enough.
I was just saying, I came into Kim's classroom in a Google Hangout for an hour and then had to take a nap. So I can imagine every day, all the time. So
yeah,
I'm agreeing, but they have ambitious goals and as well. But then actually implementing and respecting. I mean, I've been taking notes on so many things that you said, Kim, and the importance of involving educators is just imperative.
And involving people who can be interfaces, like Dan Hammer from Earthrise, Earthrise.education now, Earthrise.media. And again, this has been a wonderful start to a thread that'll be here. Thriving Online is the Monday version of my Sustain What webcast, and I have to close with a little bit of a boilerplate to thank those who make this possible. Sustain What is a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration, and now the great pause that's been enforced on us by SARS-CoV-2 and the COVID-19 pandemic. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. It's the one Earth system changing faster than the biogeophysical environment that we think of when we think of the environment. This webcast is produced as part of my work building Columbia University's new Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. As soon as we're done, right now in a few seconds, these get archived on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Periscope, Twitter. So please share the link you've been watching on. Get in touch with me. It's easy to find me at Revkin on Twitter, and come up with your own ideas and get involved with these conversations. And that's it for today's Sustain What. Now, on Wednesday, we're doing a session with the World Health Organization and Claire Wardle, who's at firstdraftnews.com, on the infodemic around the pandemic. How do we cut through all that stuff? In the same way we're talking about these challenges. And on Friday, it's about vaccination. Heidi Larson, who directs a program called the Vaccine Confidence Project, is going to be on with Renee DiResta at Stanford University's Internet Observatory, which is a thing that we need more of. And we'll be talking about right now the urgent need to get focused on the information landscape around vaccination, which is very fraught even now, and will get more fraught. So this is not just some warp speed race to come up with a vaccine. If you don't have a campaign shaping conversations that build trust and engagement, we're going to be stuck, literally, with this virus for a long time to come. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you so much.
And thanks, Dan, for Earthrise. It's the coolest thing.
Thanks, guys.
I agree.
See you soon.